Okay, so if we looked at the Brimley, textbook, you know that we looked at first local interest in education, then state interest in education. Now we're looking at federal interest in education. We give you a quote basically of what matters in the federal perspective education. The key thing that blocks everything in federal interest in education is the 10th Amendment, and you should all know that. That basically, gives the states the right, what the states need to have the rights to. So that's one of the things that's going to serve as your blocker for anything else. You need to know, and I think this is important. This is a good factual chapter, but I like the fact, and when I tell you to look at a slide for the midterm and quiz, they tell you what each president did for education, what their accomplishments were and what they were supposed to do. So I kept all that in because I thought it was interesting. But I do note that this is important. This textbook is very pro-federal control of education. It is extremely pro-federal control of education. It's basically saying that the federal government should control everything. My argument for and against that, I see that as positives. But remember, when you have a federal power, federal control of everything, you're essentially going to be teaching to the middle. That's what happens. And when you teach to the middle, there can be a lot of students that are lost along the way. So the question is, is there a right answer? Should you have a state level input? Should you have federal level input? But I think it's difficult even to compare countries, and so many people want to compare countries. That was the whole point of A Nation at Risk, was to compare country performance. You can't compare organizations that don't function properly. Because we can't do a full, true comparison of an organization, how do we have to write our dissertations if we're doing organizational comparison? We must use the method of the case study. Yes. So that means that, we can't compare unless we use a case study. So, but people don't think that way, so we have a challenge. And that's kind of where the problem is. So the 10th Amendment is very, 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 very important. The 10th Amendment is the one that said, we have a division between state and federal government, and that education is a state responsibility. This is why if the federal government would have said in the 1700s, education is handled at the federal level, things would look completely different than they look right now. 10th Amendment said state protection. I mean, that was what it is, and that's why each state has a different ruling. However, the federal government keeps trying to take more power and more control. What you need to know and what you need to remember that actually matters is this. The more money that the state takes off of the federal government, the more control that it gives it. It's like that uncle that wants you to be the rocket scientist. If you keep taking money from the uncle who wants you to be the rocket scientist, eventually he's going to expect you to be the rocket scientist. So it's the same way looking at state and federal control over education. So the Department of Education is fairly new. 1979, that's pretty new. So we have cabinet level status, and we have different people that are elected and appointed. And that's also at the state level. There could be an election for the government. There could be an appointment for the United States Department of Education. I give you this just because I thought this was interesting. It was in the book. It's basically showing you that the budgetary authority is continuously increased in billions of dollars, but I would argue that this is insignificant because of inflation. I mean, it's naturally going to increase. I mean, if we were looking at massive spikes or massive cuts, that would be different, but we're not. We're looking at a basic, standardized straight line curve where it's really just accounted for education. So this I like just because I think it's interesting. You look back on what the presidents did and what their educational accomplishment was, what was done. Each one had a different accomplishment. In a political class, we would talk a little bit more about this. I would go more into Gerald Ford and kind of the whole issue of federal aid, what that did, what that hurt. But the key thing that you want to remember really are in our last few years, we've essentially taken No Child Left Behind and just rewarded it and called it Race to the Top. in the Obama administration is big and in support of charter schools, which could be a good or bad thing depending on where you're located in. If you are in a poor urban district, charter schools could be your worst enemy because they could take away a lot of your students. If you're in a rich district, charter schools might be able to provide the support necessary that certain students in certain families need to be successful. I'm not here to tell you whether charter schools are right or wrong. I think there's more research to be done on that. If you have an opinion on that, that is certainly a Dr. Curry thing because she loves talking about charter schools. That's one of her research interests related to how they impact community collaboration. So she's definitely the person on that. So I think this matters, and I think this is important. Across the United States, the majority of funding still comes from the state. That's important, and that is a big idea. So the federal government is only responsible for about 10%. And that 10% normally, 95% of that 10% is going to large urban districts, and that's the truth. So we still have the state funding most of education, and I think that's going to stay that way. So I give you another graph that I thought was interesting from the NEA, really just looking at different levels of percents, the federal, state, and local shares in funding, where it's going, what the direction it's going in. The key thing you need to see is that federal is increasing, but they're all increasing. So it's really nothing major, nothing is, nothing is changing. Different states, the average is 10.2, but you can tell who has more federal control based off of what state you're in. New Jersey, New Hampshire are way below the average, and Louisiana and Texas are high above the average. Should Louisiana have high federal input on education?
Sure.
Why?
They're given 20% of their funding.
Where do they rank, John?
I don't know.
Dead last. So should the federal government interfere? Yeah. If they're last, federal government should probably be involved. So, that makes a difference. And so should they have input? Well, they're giving them more money, so maybe their methodology and their technique should be what matters. So how does federal aid actually get distributed? The key one that you have to know that means everything, and those of you that are Title I, special ed, your background, you know that the key thing that you worry about is really categorical aid. That's what you know, that's what you care about, because what has to be true about categorical aid? It has to be transparent. It has to be reported, you have to see where the money's coming from, and you have to document what you did to keep the money and what you did to earn the money. Most of the time, block grants really are just on educational improvement more than anything else. Well, my definition of how education can improve, it might be a million times different than how your definition is of how education could improve. General aid is just stimulus, and that's almost never reported. I put this on just because I thought this was interesting. The federal government owns about 1/3 of the land, but they own a lot of it in Nevada, Alaska, Utah, Oregon, and Idaho. So we're looking more at those states having more federal input, which is, that should come as no surprise to anybody. So here is, my commentary that you have to see. Those of you that are in suburban districts, you're going to see basically what happens at the federal level. Federal government is going to continue to gain interest, and you will have to deal with this when you become superintendents. I think we can all agree on that. But my guess is that generationally this is not going to apply to any of you. That's my guess. It truly is my guess. Unless you're at a large urban district, I think 20 to 30 years from now when the new people are coming in, they're the ones that are going to see even more federal government input running school districts. But it's not going to come now. We have to see what it looks like at the urban districts first, and once we do that, then we will see what the federal government perspective looks like. So that's it. That's the only thing that we're going to be covering related to that, and we're going to move on, and we're going to look on. We're going to look very, very, very briefly at different types of schools, like non-public schools, charter schools, and different funding.